At the turn of the century, the nations of Latin America were in turmoil. Great Britain and Germany had on more than one occasion threatened to take over Venezuela for failure to repay its loans. The last thing the United States wanted was Europe meddling in Latin American affairs. Another nation, the Dominican Republic, had been continually ripped by revolution since 1899.
I have the same desire to annex it as a gorged boa constrictor might have to swallow a porcupine wrong end too,
said Roosevelt. But by the spring of 1904, he thought he might have to do nothing but what a policeman has to do.
Chronic wrongdoing and the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to exercise of an international police power.
So when Theodore Roosevelt in 1904 created something that became known as the corollary or the addition to the Monroe Doctrine, it claimed the United States' right to intervene in all the rest of the continent in order to keep order and to prevent what he called wrongdoing. The United States set itself up then as the enforcer, as the society that would decide what the standards were and would enforce them elsewhere.
Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine changed it from a prohibition upon European meddling into a brash promise of United States regulation of the Americas. From 1898 to 1932, the United States sent troops to 9 different Caribbean nations, a total of 34 different times. In the process, small Latin American countries became tied more closely to the United States, both politically and economically. Believing that the infusion of American business dollars would stabilize the Caribbean region and keep Europe at bay, Roosevelt's successor as president, William Howard Taft, pursued a policy of dollar diplomacy, using American naval power and diplomatic pressure to help American businesses move into new markets in Latin America. By the 1920s, the United States bought nearly 60% of all Latin American exports and sold the region nearly 50% of its imports. American corporations, like the United Fruit Company, which became the largest landowner and employer in Guatemala, were powerful forces in many Latin American countries. Today, historians and policymakers continue to debate whether U.S. involvement in Latin America did more good or harm to the region. One school of thought argues that American investors transformed jungles into productive farmlands, built hospitals and sanitation facilities to eradicate disease, and constructed railroads, ports, and schools as they developed the economies of host countries. Others contend that American corporations controlled and exploited host countries by bribing politicians, stealing their natural resources, stunting their economies, and exploiting their people. And in the process, American businesses left a legacy of distrust and hatred for what some Latin Americans call Yankee imperialism. When Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, he wanted to reform American foreign policy as well as domestic politics. Both, he believed, should be conducted in accordance with America's own democratic principles. Wilson opposed Taft's dollar diplomacy as an extension abroad of American monopolistic business practices. He promised the nations of Latin America that the United States would never again seek one additional foot of territory by conquest. But as president, Wilson did send American troops into Latin American countries, including Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Mexico. Wilson's intervention in Mexico's Revolution of 1914 antagonized rebel leader Pancho Villa, who in 1916 invaded the United States and shot up the town of Columbus, New Mexico, killing 17. Outraged at the assault, Wilson sent General John J. Pershing and 6,000 troops 300 miles into Mexico for an unsuccessful hunt for Villa and his men. In the years between the end of the Civil War
and Pershing's expedition into Mexico, the United States had emerged as a major military power, expanded its trade and territory, and begun to export the American way of life to peoples in both Asia and the Caribbean.
A great war waging in Europe would soon draw the United States even more deeply into world affairs. By the early 20th century, the United States had indeed joined the ranks of the great nations of the world.